Okay,
All
so
right.
it says for some reason my internet's a little unstable, so I apologize. So hopefully I won't freeze up a lot.
You are great. All right. We want to welcome you guys all again for parent-teacher or parent conversations. I do that every week. Anyway, we're super excited to be here. And Shirley, you'll have to answer me on how you want us to do this. Catherine has now been to 5 of our parent conversations in a row. So she qualifies for our gift card. So how does she go about getting that? I forgot to ask you earlier.
Congratulations, Catherine. That is awesome. Just go ahead and email me at watson@mydiscoverydestination.com and we will get you your family experience. Congratulations. And thank you so much for supporting Parent Conversations.
Okay, perfect. And we can even put that email in the chat for you, Catherine, so you have it. Okay,
Yes.
well, okay, perfect, thanks. Well, we're gonna welcome Emily Hamilton today as our guest speaker. A little bit about her is she works as a health educator and mentoring coordinator at the USU Extension Office in Tooele County. She's also a licensed massage therapist for 19 years and operate and owned a small massage business. Also, she is very passionate about raising a good family and spending quality time together, cooking, gardening, living, and just living, I'm sorry, it cut out, and all outdoor activities. So we are super excited to have you, and we'll turn the time over to you. Remember, if you have any questions, you can write them in the chat area and we'll answer them as we go.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. JD Gunnell provided me with his PowerPoint to utilize for this garden tutorial. Again, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat and I'll try and answer the questions to the best of my ability. 1 second here. Can you guys see that PowerPoint?
It's still just showing like a list of all your Google Docs or whatever.
Okay, let's see here. 1 second. We'll see if it'll pull it up. It's coming up on my screen, so let's see here. All right, hopefully that'll.
Oh, yep, there it is.
Awesome, thank you. And if I go too fast, sometimes I ramble. If you need clarification, just let me know. So JD Gunnell actually wrote this presentation. He is an extension professor up, I believe, in Cache County. So if you guys ever have any questions regarding anything related to your garden, he's an excellent resource to utilize. If you're in other surrounding counties or any county in Utah, Utah State University Extension is in pretty much every county, and you should be able to go talk to a horticulturist in your local area. So Vegetable Gardening 101. Oh, I don't know if it's gonna let me. Sorry, hang on 1 second. I'm gonna have to work out the kinks real quick. I apologize, y'all. I might just have to share each individual slide. I don't know how to do it otherwise. And I apologize. Let's see here. Resume slideshow. Let's see if we can do it this way. Okay, resume. For some reason, it's not letting me. I almost thought to send, oh, there we go. Let me just double check and make sure it'll move on to the next screen. Yep, there we go. Okay, perfect. So again, I apologize for that. So at the Utah State University Extension, we have a ton of fact sheets available. So there's over 75 crop sheets just available for your use. When growing a garden, different things you want to keep in mind are the spacing of your plants, how many plants per person you're providing for, different times you'll harvest these plants, and different pests that may come into your garden and how to handle that. Right below is a good resource. I put it into the chat, so hopefully you guys will be able to utilize that. Maybe you can copy in your chat all the different links I provided for you guys, and or screenshot them, whatever you think will make you remember them, because they're very useful. Okay, so Utah State University Extension has provided kind of a monthly checklist also for people to utilize. You got your warm season vegetables. You can click there. Plant how you plant tomatoes, different types of corn, when to plant them. So it's really good to kind of look at the different checklists, because it'll help direct you on when you need to get your seeds either planted prior, or when you need to directly plant your seeds. So your general site selection for your garden, it typically needs to have a full sun. Anything considered full sun is 6 to 8 hours. So it just depends on your garden space. So keep that in mind though when you're picking a site for your garden. The soil needs to be well drained, typically 6 to 8 inches deep. You can add organic matter, such as compost, typically 2 to 3 inches a year. Annually means every year. And depending on your plants, you'll need to water 1 to 2 inches per week. So different types of things you need to keep in mind when you're planting a garden is your different weather considerations, even where you live, honestly, and different places where you live are considered a zone. In that forestry link I provided in the chat will allow you to determine what kind of zone you live in. So if you take a look at that and relate it back to your city and county, you'll be able to determine kind of when you can start planting your different crops. So for instance here, your average last frost date is May 15th. So I live in Tooele County. I actually consider that as my staple to when I consider planting some of my crops as well. And then along with Cache County, so your first frost date is typically October 1st, and that kind of goes along with us here in Tooele County as well. So that means you'll have frost-free days typically up in Logan to be about, at the USU campus, to be about 160 days of growing time. And then here's just some frost dates, some frost-free dates, right? So I don't even know where Amalga City is, Utah, but apparently it stays pretty cold. So you obviously have a really late average spring and then an early frost date. So your growing season's not as long as, for instance, Brigham City, that's lower on the benches, those kinds of things in the Salt Lake Valley area. You'll typically have a lot more longer growing season in the Salt Lake valleys. I guess the Wasatch Front is what they typically call it. So it's important to keep these dates in mind, right? You typically know you can grow things from May to September in Logan. That's just kind of gives you an idea of where you're at. But again, check your zoning areas. And then planting dates vary. We kind of discussed that. And then you have different types of crops, right? So you have cool season crops. They average and grow between 55 to 75 degrees outside. And then you have warm season crops who love the hot sun that are in between 70 and 90 degrees. So you want to follow your seed packets kind of when you're looking for germination, what kind of temperatures they like, how deep you want to plant them. A lot of things you'll do direct seeding, which means you'll basically put your seed right within your garden soil. And then sometimes you'll have seed starters that you'll plant before it gets warm outside. And those are typically more of your warm plants that you'll plant. So spacing's important. Obviously, you don't want to over plant, because then you'll have to either pull seedlings out, which aren't very viable to transplant once they get going. So make sure you one seed per space, especially when it comes to a lot of your radishes, your beets, carrots, those kinds of things, because you don't want too many too packed in there. So germination tips. Again, a lot of times you want that well-drained soil. For your celery, cucumbers, peas, you kind of soak them beforehand. Peas you can plant directly, or you can have them from starts. But some of those things you want to trellis once they're planted and established. We'll talk a bit more about that later. Let's see here. So your cool season crops, which I kind of discussed, they're directly seeded. You've got onions, carrots, radishes, peas, lettuce, cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage. And a lot of those bigger ones, cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, and cabbage, are usually transplanted. So again, here's another nice list. I want you to take a look at the ones that are the X's where they're recommended, and then the ones possible but not recommended. You can just see a few of those in May that are a little tougher. You might be able to get away with it depending on where you live, but also you still might just want to wait that extra 2 weeks to get them in the soil. So that's always good. So if you prepare garlic and onions and stuff, sometimes they won't come back to, like, the next season. You'll plant them early and then they'll be the next season, right? Let's see here. And then there's just a good chart. Let me know if you have any questions on that chart. Here you'll have a kind of a good idea, like again, where it's, you want to get them in, and then definitely and then it's possible to have them all planted by that time. Okay, so your warm season crops, they typically are from transplants, or you can start them as seedlings in your own home. I don't know if any of you have done that, but I've already got a bunch of mine going to transplant probably in the next 2 weeks. Mother's Day is usually a good gauge for me, but then I also watch the weather. So your warm season crops are tomatoes, peppers, beans, herbs, again, cucumbers, squash, melons, corn. And then the corn, all of these cucumbers, squash, melons, and corn can be directly seeded. And then I think we'll talk about seedlings in a minute. So again, you can use some of your transplants, which are your tomatoes typically, I've got my pumpkins going indoors right now. Melons, those kinds of things. So some people consider greenhouses, another name known for greenhouses is a hothouse, depending on what you utilize, because they have different things you can order on Amazon as like miniature hothouses to get your seedlings and stuff started outside if you don't want to do it in your house. So those are kind of some good ideas. They're fairly cheap. So you want to just make sure there's dark green color, true leaves. You'll notice that your first initial sprouts will your leaves will fall off, and there's just good bloom. So that's good. You obviously want a good soil content when you're starting your transplants. So make sure you have good potting soil. And then obviously your young plants with well-drained soil, they don't have as much of a root base, or they're typically in smaller containers. And so you want to make sure that they stay moist. I hope that makes sense. So you'll water them frequently. You don't want to overwater them. So, but you want to make sure they're draining well and they're just growing well, right? So that is a good looking cucumber or melon, or even it could be a squash right there. Those are the things you want to look for.
Emily, there's a question from
Yeah.
Catherine. It said, is there a way to nurse starts back to healthy if they start to look too pale?
So I would look at some type of so it could be a fertilizing problem potentially. Sometimes it might just need a little calcium. It depends on what you started your starts in, and it could be an overwatering issue too. So if they're too yellow, I would let them dry out and see if they perk up a little bit, because you could be overwatering. I hope does that answer your question? Sorry, I can't see in the chat, so I hope that answers your question.
Yep, she said thank you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so when to start your transplants? We talked about some of your bigger ones. Typically kind of earlier, you've got your cold seasoned vegetables here that actually do well in the colder months. So those are like your broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, cauliflower. Let's see. Oh, celery too, because that's hardy, more water tolerant. And then obviously you can see right after the vegetable crop, the days to maturity. So that's typically when you'll start seeing fruit coming from your plant. I hope that makes sense. And then even though the colder ones are on this list, you'll have some ones that are actually the warm season crops. And right there, today's maturity, it'll show you typically how long it takes for them to mature. So I typically will transplant sometimes my starts. So I'll start them sometimes in March, keep them inside, and then transplant them into a bigger container. So then the roots can grow a little bit bigger and they'll just be a little bit hardier. So by the time I transplant them outside in May, they're a pretty mature seedling and start. I hope that makes sense. So I don't put them out right away. I'll even transplant them again into a bigger container to get their root system going really well. And then in that okay time to get them outside, I'll plant them then. But even on fair weather days, I'll put them outside sometimes to just get used to the wind and the different type of sunlight or lighting system that they're having, so they're not so shocked when I transplant them. And we'll talk about that a little bit further. So you'll just notice like the tomatoes have a 60 to 90 day maturity level. Seedlings, seeding to transplant, 4 to 6 weeks. So basically you're looking at about a month and a half. It's kind of what I was just discussing about and it just depends on how mature you want your plants when you do it. If you want them more mature, I usually start them in seedlings and little starts earlier, and then I'll transplant them into a bigger pot. And also then they get the extra nutrient that maybe the waters bleached out, not necessarily bleached or leached out, but some of the nutrients from the starter seedlings. And so I'll put them in a new container with new nutrient rich soil. So that just kind of gives you an idea of how I do it. And especially since I feel like I get such a late start, and I certainly love tomatoes in June and July. So that's kind of why I like to do them earlier inside. Okay, so transplanting tips, harden them off for a week. It kind of goes along with what I was just saying, how sometimes my starters, I'll have them in a bigger container, and I'll actually start putting them outside. But by the time they're mature and it's getting warmer outside, so those nights where you notice there's not going to be a frost, I'll start leaving them out. Obviously, you don't want it to go below 50 degrees out, right? I believe, and if that's the case, cover them or just bring them inside, right? Sometimes I'll move them, they'll be outside in a sunny, warm, hot day. And sometimes I'll just move them into my garage or where they're protected from the wind and the cold, freezing cold. The other ways you can help that is cover them. So, and then you just want to be careful of the stems when you take them out of their containers, right? So your garden's ready to go. You want to plant them in your garden. And then you'll water them regularly for 2 weeks, right? And it's best to plant in the early evening. You want to plant your tomatoes a little bit deeper because then their root systems can grow a little bit stronger. Watch for transplant shock. And that's why it's important to harden them off, because if you just put them in there sometimes without the hardening, it typically, sometimes they can get shocked. But mostly the time, if you're just buying your plants from, say, Lowe's, Walmart, Home Depot, they're outside a lot anyway, or like right when they come off the truck, right? So they're already pretty much hardened, right? For the most part. You just got to watch the weather on your end because you don't want to lose that investment that you're putting into your garden. So then again, frost protection, like I said, watch that weather and look at this picture. You can see that they have really good rows of different things that they planted. And then if you see the rows, but then like also if you go the other way, they're kind of considered blocks. If you look at it from a different angle. So then that way you can actually plant certain types of vegetables in certain areas. So that's kind of fun too to keep in mind, especially when you're planting like a bunch of corn at different times, those kinds of things. But think mini greenhouse as far as frost protection goes, because obviously, again, it's an investment. You want to be able to harvest what you plant. So again, this is kind of goes place 1 to 2 weeks out prior. That goes along with
We have another question.
Okay, perfect.
Sorry. Lindsay's asked, I think I missed what it means to harden them and how to do that.
Okay, perfect. So hardening goes along with if you have seedlings that you plant at home, little starters that you plant at home, you don't want to just put them right outside in the direct elements, right? They're prone to insects, they're prone to frost, they're prone to sunburn damage. There's lots of things that can happen when you just take them from inside your house where they have no hard root system to the harsh wind. So it's important to basically, once the weather warms up, or in this instant, you can see in this picture where they planted them in their garden, but then they covered them. So that's only just if there's frost. This is just for frost. But if you plant them directly, you want to basically still have them in their little containers. And then start bringing them outside a week or two prior to planting. I hope that makes sense. But like I was saying, the plants that you get from Lowe's, Home Depot, Walmart, those plants are really outside already a lot. So those are typically already hardened. Does that make sense? And you can typically plant them directly in your garden.
Yes, thanks. So just real quick. So if we have seedlings at home, then we just go stick them outside within their container still for another week or two and then transplant them into the garden.
Yes. So I would start doing that. But watch the water too. So that's the thing with your seedlings. Depending on the size of the container, sometimes they can dry out quickly, because of how hot it is outside or the wind. So make sure they still stay fairly moist when they're young plantlings. Does that make sense? Because then that'll harden them. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, she put in the chat. Yes, thanks.
Okay, perfect. All righty. So the extra frost protection gives them like 5 degrees protection. Again, you can use different. I just use a sheet, you guys, in the like a twin bed sheet in the fall. It helps protect from that cold freeze. And since they're typically pretty hot during the day, it insulates that heat in them. So towards the fall, if I want to get a few extra weeks out of my tomatoes or squash or anything, I usually just use a sheet, but you can use in here you can see the wall of water around your tomatoes kind of helps the heat. You put water typically in these little wall of waters, and then the sun heats them up and keeps the plants warm and insulated. Basically, again, the plastic heats up, helps the tomato plants. Okay, so we want to talk fertilizers, garden soil, the whole nine. I put the link in there for soil testing. Typically, Utah has a lot of salt in their soil. So it's important that we, if you want to, or if you're having trouble planting something in a particular part of your garden, I believe it can cost anywhere from $10 to up to $35 for a complete soil test. And what you do is they make you mix up your soil in your garden, whether you want just a particular area or a bunch of different areas. I believe they still just make you mix it all up, and then you send it in to them. And then they'll tell you what you're missing in your garden or what you'd need in your garden. So, but in this instance, for our vegetable gardens and for fertilizers in general, the rule of thumb is NPK. So nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. As you see here, nitrogen goes on top. It helps aerate the soil. Down below is your phosphorus. And then potassium you want all around. So there's lots of different products out there. Slow release products are sometimes some granular products. You got organic fertilizers that you can use. So it depends on what you need, right? So you can have 1 to 2 pounds of nitrogen, depending on, so it says per 1,000 square feet in a 10-foot row. You can use a low use for your beans and your peas. Moderate use are for more of your cold and warm season vegetables. So you can use 2 to 3 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. A third a cup of that for a 10-foot row. And then high use of nitrogen is your corn, onions, and potatoes. But NPK, think NPK. So the scoop on poop. Good, cheap organic matter takes time to break down. So if you want to do your own fertilizing or have your own compost, it takes time to break down. Sometimes, for instance, my compost, I don't have one that you slow turn or anything. I go out there with a rake and a shovel and I turn it myself. But I get really good compost pretty much every year. I use a lot of organic material, things that I cook with. I just have the kids go out there and throw it out there once we're done, and it's going to go to waste. So we might as well put it back into what we're going to eat. But it takes time to break down. Sometimes, depending on what you're using, it can introduce a weed seed. So watch out for that. And again, we have high salts just in the state of Utah. So just watch out for that, because obviously you don't want too much of that in your organic material, because that way it'll just cut down on how much growth you could potentially have. But you want that to cure again for 6 months or longer. You can introduce cover crops for your garden to increase that nitrogen. So when you do that, and different types of ones you can use are vetch, clover, buckwheat, winter wheat, radish. You'll typically plant after harvest. It'll add to the soil health. And then you basically, before you're ready to get your garden prepped for the season, you'll till under before the seed set. But you also want to be careful sometimes on how you till your garden as well. Again, you want well-drained soil, the whole nine. Nice deep mounds, 6 to 8 inches sometimes. Okay, so the timing and the amount of watering depends on the soil type you have, the season, and then the crop, right? Because different types of crops don't require as much. We know our seedlings require a little bit more because they're tender, but they still need to be well-drained. So deep-rooted crops tomatoes, corn, vines, potatoes. Your vines are your peas and sometimes your cucumbers. You can water them 5 to 7 day intervals. Shallow rooted crops, those are typically your lower to the level ground crops. You've got lettuce, cabbages, onions, radish. I water them every 3 to 4 days, right? Those are closer to the surface every 3 to 4 days. So crop family rotation. So it's important that you rotate your crops from season to season. And down the bottom, you can see the loops where it's like, okay, you've got your fruit crop, and then you maybe want to plant it next year in your grass crop. And then you've got your grass crop. You potentially want to do the following year in your legume crop, which are your peas and your beans. And then your legume crop into your salad crop, which is your lettuce, radishes, carrots, and onions. Again, it helps your soil. And it's good to introduce different species. And sometimes it'll help downplay pests. So I hope that list makes sense. So your salad crops, and a lot of them are cool seasoned. If you pick them in the hot season, they're a little bit more bitter. They don't taste as fresh. Again, you don't necessarily want to water stress them because they're shallow rooted. So every, 2 to 4 days. 3 to 4 days. I typically will stick my finger down there and see sometimes near the root system and just see how it's feeling, right? Because again, it depends on weather and the season, as we discussed just a few minutes ago. Let's see. You can harvest them anytime, which is great. And if you want to do another season planting of this, late July, where it starts to cool down, August, then you'll get another, if you seed them, direct seed like we talked about, you'll get those, you'll get a fall crop, right? They'll come up in that cooler season, September, and then kind of before you harvest in October, before you shut your garden down. So salad toppers are your radishes, carrots, cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage. So they're the cool season. A lot of them are cool season ones. Again, they're shallow rooted. Do not stress them with too much water. Typically you have your transplant starts, which are your cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower. You know when they're ready by the root crops. They have the bulging tops. You can actually see the vegetable, right? Your big broccoli, your cauliflower, why can't I think of the name? Sorry, I just had a stall on my lapse of thought. But anyway, they have full heads. They're ready to go. Brussels sprouts. That's what I was trying to think of. Sorry, guys. Your Brussels sprouts. Okay, so onions and garlic. These are the ones that where you plant in the fall and then you'll harvest later. And then when you harvest your garlic and your onion, you usually want to store them in a dry, cool place for 1 to 2 weeks before you even eat them, right? So you just want to let them cure, let them sit. Your fruiting crops, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, tomatillos. Again, you want to avoid that 50 degrees or lower. I have found that to be this case also with some of my seasonal herbs as well. The ones that are most cold tolerant or intolerant, I would say, are your basils. Your basils do not really do well below 50 degrees. Deep rooted provide even water. They love the sunshine. Not too much nitrogen in your tomatoes because it'll create big, huge vines, but very little fruit. So certain things to look out for. So you might have blossom or end rot. You'll see that on the picture to the right. There's a calcium deficiency, or there's dark sunken tissue under the fruit. So typically this will happen when there's like irregular irrigation issues. Sometimes it just needs calcium, right? So I suggest, especially if you have a tomato plant with blossom end rot, to cut off those areas and then make sure you add calcium to the soil. Obviously, be careful of how much you apply. Shoulder cracking, you can see that on the top of the tomato. This happens sometimes in my garden. I have an overhead irrigation, but even when I harvest my crop, it's still good. So I just cut that top off and I'll still utilize it in my salad. Some diseases, so a hybrid versus an heirloom. So heirlooms have been around forever, ever. Hybrids are plants taken from heirlooms and mixed with another breed of tomato per se, and they come up with these fancy ones below: VFNA, TMV, TSVW. They're just different types of tomatoes, right? And when they become a hybrid, they're just basically a parent tomato from two different tomatoes, right? And then from there you can create more hybrids. Just a different gene sequence. Cool season. Potatoes are cool season. Avoid cold soils. You typically want to buy certified seed potatoes. 2 eyes per piece. Plant 4 to 6 inches deep. And they'll come up as they grow. Avoid fertilizers after July. And then you typically want to store them, again, like your onions and your garlic, for 1 to 2 weeks in a cool, dry spot. And they last forever, again, with your onions and your garlic. Potatoes are pretty hardy and last a really long time. Your vining crops, they're warm season for sure. You don't want to overwater these as well. And you can transplant or seed them. I always do transplants because I feel that I can, again, boost my harvesting date up if I actually do them earlier, but that's just my preference. So your harvest tips for this one, for your watermelon, you want to just make sure the ground, the color of your fruit is great. Typically the vine it comes off of has drier tendrils. It almost tells you that it's done. It'll basically say, hey, your watermelon's ripe for the picking, if that makes sense. Cantaloupe, kind of a similar situation. Winter squash, you can just use your fingernail to get that off, typically off the vine. Here's some good pictures of that as well. And then that actually shows, I guess, poor flavor, pithy texture, overwatering causes. So you can see here on the cantaloupe, that's that pithy texture. And then overwatering on the watermelon, you can see where the color differentiates. Again, just make sure that that's good. That's overwatering too. You can see on the top left with that summer squash that's just getting too much, but you're still getting your fruit. So just watch for it. Legumes, so they like their nitrogen from the atmosphere. They're cool and kind of warm season crops. They're good transition vegetable from cold to warm season. And there are bush and vine types. I usually like the vining, and I usually will have a trellis system set up for mine. So those are always decent. So water is crucial during the flowering stage. And peas are awesome for creating nitrogen. You like for cover crops, this one's a pretty good one. Again, though, you still want to rotate your crops. And then pick when they're young but filled. Obviously, you want peas in your pea pod, right? And then you can also allow the beans to dry on the vine. But they're awesome just to snack on when you're out in the garden, mowing the lawn, those kinds of things. So sweet corn, avoid planting in cold soils. You'll want to seed every 2 weeks until June. And then this is kind of where I was talking about, you want to do the block planting. You can plant 1 inch between plants or 2 inches between rows. And then you typically want to plant them close together. So it takes about 15 to 25 days from silk to mature. And then what I have found too with a little bit of the sweet corn, especially in Utah, because we have such a hot growing season, kind of jumps from winter to spring to summer kind of quick where we live. That the corn takes a little bit, even though you like that well-drained soil, but to me, I feel because it gets hot fast that the corn takes a little bit more water. So just watch it and gauge it. Asparagus is a perennial. So we talked about annual, something you need to do every year. A lot of the vegetables here in Utah are annuals. Obviously, you're planting them either at home or you're buying them from a store for your garden. A perennial crop is something that comes up every year. Asparagus is one of them. Obviously, you have some fruit trees potentially that obviously will come back every year. There are a ton of perennial herbs. So if you guys, I suggest if you want to have an herb garden or want to create a scented herb garden, there's tons of perennials from lavender to not basil, even some rosemaries. There's a tons of different perennial herbs that you can use and cook with regularly. So make sure you take a look at those so that way you don't necessarily have to spend money every year for herbs in your garden. So for asparagus, again, it's perennial, comes up every year. You want to plant bare root or seed. You want to dig a big 8-inch deep trench, fill in 2 inches at a time. So they don't like to sit wet. It's a kind of a miscommon thing. A lot of people think, oh, well, my asparagus does great down by the river and the creek just below, but it doesn't like to sit wet. So you'll see it kind of off to the side typically of something that's wet. So, and then you want to allow the ferns to grow and die down naturally. So weed and pest control. There's several approaches to weed and pest control. You have your cultural mulches. There's different, obviously, mulches you can use to cut back on pests that might come into your garden, or cut down on the different weeds that are coming into your garden. Mechanical, typically that's where you use a hoe or a shovel, or you pull them, or those kinds of things for weeds. Biological, that's chickens you bring in your yard. Typically you'll see them grubbing, they're eating bad pests out of your garden. And then chemicals, pesticides are something that you can use to get rid of weeds and pests, but you have to be really careful of where and when and how you use them. I suggest if you're going to use pesticides that you read the label to a T on how to distribute that in your garden, just because you want to be careful of the natural, like obviously, especially in your vegetable garden, you're going to be eating that, right? Is it something that's going to be harmful to you or your family? But also think about what germinates your garden and makes your garden grow. You've got your bees and your different types of insects that actually go around and help germinate a lot of your fruit and your harvest stuff. So just think about that when you are going to be spraying those. Typically, you want to make sure the wind's not blowing. And a lot of people, I think, suggest at like before it gets dark, because a lot of the insects, the good ones that germinate, are typically in bed by then. So anyway, that is our presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I hope that was helpful. It looks like more people came. That's exciting.
Yes, thank you so much. Does anybody have any more questions for Emily before we end?
I'm going to start. Pardon them. And I love a lot of good, even just like pesticides, natural, like you can plant barriers with flowers even around your garden. So you have some pretty color. You can just do different types of flowers in your garden that'll actually help deter pests. But you can also have them as dazzling attractors to those bees and things that are going to come help fertilize your different fruit too.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Nobody else has any more questions?
Emily, this is great information. Thank you so much for sharing it. My husband is actually out doing the whole fertilizing thing right now.
Oh, I love that. That's so fun. It's a great time to get it going. And I don't know about you guys, but a good weed and feed this time of year, all that for your lawn is fantastic, especially because I think it's about to storm. So gets just all those nutrients in there, helps get your garden a good start. So
Yeah, he was talking about the wind blowing and he had to wait and all of that, but it stopped. So he went
hey.
out. He had an appointment today, so he actually didn't go to work. So he's using the day to do some of this stuff.
Oh, I love it. And hopefully it's not raining yet where you're at. And
No, it's perfect weather from what you said.
awesome. Well, that's great. I'm so excited.
Yeah, I was telling Emily before we started, my dad's retired and he loves to garden. He does they have 4 acres in Syracuse and he does about an acre worth of gardening. So yeah, it's crazy. All right. Well, thank you again, Emily, for joining us today. I want to welcome Mel. She's new for the first time to our parent conversations. I hope you enjoyed it today. Just remember, everybody, that if you attend 5 in a row of parent conversations, you get a gift card for a family adventure like swimming or axe throwing or whatever. You get to help decide. Also, if you bring a friend, that also helps you get gift cards too. So next week, we're still figuring out our guest speaker, but it's going to be on family mealtime and board games. And I love board games, so I'm excited. So we will see you guys all next week. Thank you again.
Kim, if you don't know Sarah Patino, she's in my office. She does the food sense and those kinds of things. Maybe you can email her and see if she'd like to be your guest speaker.
Great. Could you send me her information?
Yeah, she's fantastic.
Thank you so much for that. Okay, great. We will see you guys all next week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.